back to Haunted and Historic Australia and our Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts episodes with the Sydney Park Serial Killer series. In this episode, we take a look at the Mosman nursemaid murder of Betty Van Tonder. Episode 8 brings us quite a mystery. A young Dutch South African woman who had only been in Australia for a year is murdered near her live-in workplace on Cardinia Road, Mosman. There was speculation she could have taken her life. However, most evidence pointed to a killer, a Sydney Park serial killer. Let us start with Betty's beginnings. Cornelia Elizabeth Johanna Wilhelmina Van Tonder was born in approximately 1918 and lived with her family in Cape Town, South Africa. I have also found several Van Tonder family members in Cape Colony earlier than this time, which leads me to believe that she was most likely born in this area. She was a nursemaid to a family of George and Hilda Scott, with their children Robert and Helen, and was very much considered a part of the family. They started off in Cape Town, and when the family moved to Sydney in February of 1939, so did Betty to continue her service with them, leaving behind her family and an apparent love interest that didn't pan out. Upon arriving in Sydney, the family moved into Cardinia Road in Mosman, an area which was very popular, a recreational and pleasure ground on Sydney Harbour. From around the 1870s established, and at this point in 1940 was booming with tourists and people, mainly in the summer months. She worked with the Scott family for a time, a few months in, and began to talk to the other maids about how lonely and homesick she was, and the fact that the Scott family weren't treating her as well as they were when they were back in South Africa. It is claimed that shortly after, she left the Scott family and began to work a few houses down at the Young family after getting a job through one of her nurse friends. She worked with the Youngs until her death. On Sunday, March 10th, 1940, the body of 23-year-old Betty Van Tonder was discovered in bushland at the corner of Cardinia and Morella Roads. She wore a floral summer dress, but her left leg was bare, one white leather high heel missing also from her foot. Silk stocking, with suspenders still attached, was tightly twisted around her larynx. Tall and athletic, Betty's body lay battered and covered in ants, a deep abrasion marking the back of her head where the sharp edge of a rock had struck. Nearby, her handbag contained 3 handkerchiefs, a pocket of cigarettes and a torn cinema ticket. Despite this unsettling scene, police were quick to label her death a suicide. Now, what gave them that idea would surprise you. Despite being lonely, Betty spent many hours reading crime novels. One in particular was found on her bedside table. Betty had been reported missing when she didn't return to duties on the Saturday, and police were quick to comb her room for any information, and finding many horror novels or mystery novels. This, coupled with some of her closest maid friends stating she was depressed and homesick, led police straight to suicide, although the evidence strongly suggested murder. They started to interview many of Betty's friends, colleagues, and those that she was employed by. The Scotts stated, "For the first 3 months of our residence in Australia, things seemed to be quite normal." Mr. Scott later said in the inquest that they took a paternal interest in the girl. They enjoyed having her around like she was part of the family, which seemed to be true if she was going to follow them across the Pacific to another country, abandoning her own family and life back home. But what made things change? She told the maid that she was very unhappy and did not think the people were treating her as well as when she was living in South Africa with them. She wanted to be away from them. Jessie Blackman testified at the inquest. Betty said she was so unhappy she thought of poisoning herself. I told her it was a terrible thing to do, and to put it out of her mind. If she was so unhappy, I would try to help her get another job. 2 days later, Betty found work nearby in the home of Henry and Louisa Young. Well known in Mosman, Mrs. Young hosted Sunday school sessions at their residence. We gave Betty every Sunday off, as well as another day off each week, Mr. Young told the Daily Telegraph. She didn't share much about how she spent her free time. Determined to improve her broken English, Betty read crime novels, but her homesickness remained severe. Her final day, Friday, March 8th, was spent in Mosman. She left the house about 12:30, saying she was going to see the doctor, Byrne recalled. Betty had been receiving treatment from Dr. Mervyn Elliott Smith on Military Road. When questioned about her consultation, the doctor stated it was an internal problem, something that resulted possibly from childbirth or an abortion, but apparently she didn't go into the details with him. This is quite strange. Could this have been the interest she had before leaving Cape Town? Or could perhaps this be something secretive between her and her previous employer, Mr. Scott? At 1:30 p.m, Betty visited Arthur Shute, a hairdresser on Military Road. She asked about getting her hair waved, or putting waves in it. I suggested she visit my neighbour across the street, who had more experience, as her hair was very straight and disorderly. It had been cut into an Eton style about 3 months ago, and it was that awkward transition period growing into something fuller. Making an appointment, Betty arrived at 4 p.m. at June Russell's salon across the road for a perm. Her hair was very short, recalled hairdresser Winifred Wintel during the court proceedings. She told me, "Do the best you can." She left somewhere between 6 and 6:15. Afterwards, Betty visited Matron Effins, a local chiropodist, to have a dressing changed on a corn. Then she made her way to the Rex Theatre in Mosman to watch a film. Usherette Veronica Quinn admitted Betty to the stall section at around 8 p.m. "I couldn't say exactly where she sat," Quinn told the coroner. "She didn't leave the theatre during the screening, and the performance ended about 11 o'clock. Betty had always attended the theatre alone, and March 8 was no different. "She always smiled and said goodnight," Quinn added. "She did that on March 8, just as usual." By 10 a.m. the next morning, Saturday, March 9, Betty Van Tonder was reported missing. She never returned home after the movie. To this day, one detail remains shrouded in mystery. An anonymous phone call placed to the ambulance station at 11:30 p.m. that night, being Saturday. The caller reported a woman lying dead in the scrub at Clifton Gardens, or Chowder Bay Reserve. Immediately, they conducted a search at night, but as they found nothing, resumed in the early hours of the morning when daylight first broke. And at 8:15 a.m. on Sunday, March 10th, Constable Fraser Gilligan of North Sydney Police Station discovered Betty's body beside a large flat rock at the end of Cardinia Road. Coroner Edward Oram determined that Betty Van Tonder had died of asphyxiation due to strangulation. A silk stocking had been tightly wound around her throat. But how such a stocking came to be so wound, he concluded, whether wilfully by herself or feloniously and maliciously by some other person or persons unknown, the evidence adduced does not enable me to say. So what happened to Betty? A letter was received the following day to the police station from the anonymous caller, stating that on the Saturday in the morning he'd been walking through the path that leads down to the shoreline of the Sydney Harbour. He found about midway there was a woman laying upon a large flat rock. He thought she'd fallen somehow and had been knocked unconscious. Climbing up to the rock to check on her, he proceeded to carry her down and lay her onto the ground. Once laying her down, he noticed the stocking around her throat. Realising it was a murder scene, he quickly fled, and then only later that night contacted police. He went on in the letter to state that there were many people on the track that day and he assumed someone would have reported it. But perhaps him bringing her down under the rock placed her out of sight slightly and she was undetected. And when he hadn't heard it that night on the news, he knew he had to let them know. Was this man an innocent bystander, or was he the murderer with a guilty conscience? Detectives had mixed responses from the other maids. Some stated that she hated men and was very depressed at the thought of them. And then one closest to her said that she'd been seeing a man secretly. There are so many theories about how she met her end. Suicide because she was homesick or couldn't have the man she wanted. Murder by the man she wanted, who didn't want her, or didn't want the secret getting out. Murdered by a man she rejected, who wanted her. Or a random attack from someone who followed her back from the pictures. Possibly a Sydney Park serial killer. It was a strange state of affairs, and nothing ever came of it. But there were quite a few theories. Clearly, she wasn't strong enough to tie a stocking around her own neck. Even the police were able to dismiss that after tests they did with stockings around their necks. Even so, they didn't discount suicide. They'd stated she had so many crime novels laying about in her bedroom, more than a normal person. Well, by whose standard are we measuring this? Maybe of the women of 1940, but definitely not now. But she wasn't the only one strangled by a stocking. Hilda, in the early 30s, she was strangled with a stocking. And the stocking strangulation of Dorothy May Everett, 27-year-old kitchen maid at the Broughton Church of England Boys' School in Newcastle in 1937. She was believed to have been murdered and left in the school by the handyman or janitor for the school. But with lack of evidence, he was acquitted. And the dreadful stocking murder of Nancy Richards, only 16 years old, murdered in her bed by her foster father, Harold James Richards. Why? Because he was infatuated with a child that was brought up by them and his wife from 18 months old. Nancy had been outraged by her stepfather over the fact that she was interested in boys now, and Daddy wouldn't have any of that, over her dead body. Now, an interesting thing about that particular case was that it was several months after Betty had been murdered, and where they lived, the Richards family, was in Willoughby, which was a neighbouring suburb of Mosman. But of course, it was never checked out whether Harold James Richards had killed Betty also. So Betty von Tonder's murder was never solved. The informant never came forward. All the theories the police had were never followed through. There was just never enough evidence to pin it on anyone, any of the suspects that they had. That as well as the suicide theory. Sadly, Betty takes this one to the grave. Episode 8 follows all the others, mostly unsolved. Stay tuned because we aren't finished. There's more women who have been murdered in parklands, possibly by the same or many Sydney Park serial killers. Don't forget to give us a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so you're aware when we're posting episode 9 of the Sydney Park serial killer.